The Whispering Shadows of Blackmoor Manor. It was a raw, fog-laden evening in the autumn of 1897, when the affair that I have come to call the Whispering Shadows of Blackmoor Manor first intruded upon the quiet routine of our rooms at 221B Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes was reclining upon the sofa, his long legs stretched before him, a copy of the evening paper discarded at his side, while he idly scraped a melancholy air upon his violin. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the chemical-stained deal table and the scattered paraphernalia of his latest experiments. I had just settled into my armchair with a pipe and a medical journal when the boy in buttons brought up a telegram upon a salver. Holmes glanced at the orange envelope with that quick, darting look of interest which told me at once that the contents were not commonplace. He slit it open with his pocket knife, scanned the lines in silence, and then, with a faint smile that bespoke anticipation, handed it across to me. The message ran thus: To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. My uncle Sir Reginald Blackmoor has vanished from his locked study 2 nights ago. A note left behind speaks of hidden treasure and whispers in the dark. Local police baffled. Family legends of curse and bats in the cellars. Beg you come at once. Blackmoor Manor, Yorkshire moors. Drawsbridge only access across moat. I am in mortal fear. Lady Eleanor Blackmoor. Treasure, curses, bats, and a moat, murmured Holmes, his eyes gleaming. The ingredients are melodramatic, Watson, but the dish may yet prove palatable. What say you to a journey into the north? I required little persuasion. The prospect of fresh air after weeks of London fog, combined with the promise of one of my friend's inimitable adventures, was irresistible. Within the hour we had packed our bags, Holmes including, as was his custom, his portable chemical case and a small dark lantern, and by the following morning we were seated in a first-class compartment bound for York. The journey northward was tedious, the rain lashing the windows in sheets, but Holmes remained in excellent spirits, discoursing upon the history of Yorkshire smuggling and the architectural peculiarities of moated manor houses. At York we hired a dog cart and set off across the moors, the wind whipping our capes about us as the light began to fail. At length, as the last crimson streaks of sunset bled into the horizon, we came within sight of Blackmoor Manor. I confess the spectacle impressed itself upon my mind with an almost theatrical grandeur. The house rose sombre and massive from the midst of a wide, reed-fringed moat whose black waters reflected the dying light like polished obsidian. A single narrow causeway led to an ancient drawbridge, now permanently lowered but flanked by rusted chains that creaked mournfully in the breeze. Beyond the bridge the manor itself loomed, 3 stories of weathered stone, its tall chimneys and pointed turrets silhouetted against the darkening sky, while ivy clung to the walls like a living shroud. Gargoyles leered from the eaves, and every window seemed to watch our approach with suspicious intent. As our cart rumbled across the drawbridge, the hollow echo beneath the planks suggested depths I cared not to contemplate. A butler of formidable dignity, tall, gaunt, with iron-grey hair and a face as impassive as the stone around him, awaited us at the great oaken door. He introduced himself as Hargrove, and conducted us through a vaulted entrance hall where armour and ancient portraits lined the walls, and the air carried the faint, unmistakable scent of damp and decay. We were shown into a long panelled drawing-room where a log fire blazed upon the hearth, throwing ruddy light upon the anxious figure who rose to greet us. Lady Eleanor Blackmoor was a woman of perhaps 30, pale and slender, with dark hair drawn severely back and eyes that betrayed both exhaustion and fear. She wore a simple gown of black silk, relieved only by a single brooch at her throat. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Thank heaven you have come. she said, her voice trembling slightly as she pressed Holmes's hand. "I fear my uncle has met with foul play, or worse, that the old family curse has claimed him at last." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray compose yourself, Lady Eleanor. Begin at the beginning and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." She sank into a chair and with an effort mastered her emotion. "2 nights ago," she began, "my uncle retired to his study as usual after dinner. He was in excellent spirits, having spent the day poring over certain old family papers. He spoke excitedly of a discovery, of proof, he said, that the lost Blackmoor treasure was no mere legend. At 11 o'clock, Hargrove locked the study door from the outside at Sir Reginald's own request. He was most particular about being undisturbed when working late, and retired. In the morning the door was still locked, the key upon the inside. Yet when we forced an entry, the room was empty. Only this note remained upon his desk." She handed Holmes a single sheet of heavy paper. In a bold, impatient hand were scrawled the words, "The treasure whispers in the dark. Beware the wings of night." Holmes examined the note beneath the lamp, his brows drawn together in concentration. "Curious," he murmured. "The handwriting is undoubtedly your uncle's?" "Yes. And the reference to wings of night. The country folk hereabouts have long spoken of great swarms of bats that issue from caverns beneath the house. They say the creatures guard the treasure and bring madness or death to any who seek it." At that moment the door opened to admit 3 further persons whom Lady Eleanor introduced as the remaining members of the household. First came Dr. Vivian Thorne, a handsome woman in her middle 30s, sharp-featured and alert, whom I took at once for a scholar. She carried a leather portfolio and regarded us with keen professional interest. Next was Captain Silas Reed, a burly, weather-beaten man with a reddish beard and a rolling gait that proclaimed the seaman even before he spoke. Lastly entered Hargrove again, bearing a tray of refreshments, his face as expressionless as ever. While we partook of coffee, Holmes questioned each in turn, drawing out their movements on the night of the disappearance. All professed ignorance of Sir Reginald's fate, though I noted that Captain Reed's eyes lingered upon Lady Eleanor with a mixture of avarice and something darker, while Dr. Thorne seemed unusually absorbed in the ancient tapestries depicting smugglers and hidden hoards. Night had now fallen completely. Outside, the wind moaned about the eaves and the moat waters lapped sullenly against the stone. Holmes requested to be shown the study without delay. Lady Eleanor led us up a broad staircase and along a corridor lined with suits of armour, whose empty visors seemed to follow our progress. At the far end she unlocked a heavy door and we stepped into Sir Reginald's sanctum. The room was large and comfortably furnished, with bookshelves reaching to the ceiling and a great desk before the window. Papers lay scattered as though abandoned in haste. An inkstand stood open, a pen beside it. Upon the blotter lay a fragment of vellum, a portion of an old map, half consumed by fire in the grate. Holmes pounced upon it with eagerness, holding it to the light. "Medieval, certainly," he said, "and bearing symbols suggestive of concealed passages. Note the compass rose and these curious wing-like markings." As he spoke, a sudden draught stirred the curtains, and from somewhere far below us came a faint, eerie sound, as of countless soft wings beating in unison. Lady Eleanor turned pale. "The bats," she whispered. "They are waking." Holmes's eyes narrowed. He crossed to the hearth, knelt, and passed his hand over the oak floorboards. After a moment, his fingers paused upon one that seemed slightly loose. With the blade of his pocket knife, he prized it up, revealing beneath a small iron ring. "Aha!" he exclaimed softly. "A trapdoor, Watson, and recently used, unless I am much mistaken." We gazed down into a black void from which rose a breath of chill, damp air. And even as we stood there transfixed, a low, whispering murmur seemed to rise from the depths below, as though the very stones of Blackmoor Manor were speaking secrets long buried. I little guessed, as I stared into that abyss, how deep those secrets ran, nor what perils awaited us in the labyrinth that lay beneath the ancient house. The discovery of the concealed trapdoor in Sir Reginald's study filled me with a mixture of excitement and foreboding. Holmes, however, wasted no time upon sentiment. With the aid of his pocket lantern, he lowered himself nimbly into the opening, bidding me follow with the caution that the rungs of the iron ladder fixed to the wall were slick with damp. Lady Eleanor and the others remained above, their faces pale discs in the lamplight, but Holmes insisted that only Watson should accompany him upon this first reconnaissance. The descent was longer than I had anticipated, some 20 feet, I judged, before my boots touched solid stone. We found ourselves in a narrow passage hewn from the living rock, its walls glistening with moisture and its air heavy with the smell of earth and decay. Holmes moved forward with that silent, cat-like tread of his, the beam of his lantern picking out cobwebs that hung like tattered veils and occasional patches of pale fungus upon the stones. "Smuggler's work, Watson," he murmured, running his fingers along a chisel mark. 18th century, I should say. Observe how the passage curves gently to the left, designed to baffle pursuit and to muffle sound. We had advanced perhaps 50 yards when a sudden rush of cold air struck our faces, accompanied by a faint, leathery fluttering. The next instant, the darkness ahead seemed to explode into movement. A great cloud of bats poured towards us, hundreds, nay thousands of the creatures, their wings beating with a dry, papery sound that filled the tunnel like the rustle of dead leaves in a gale. I confess I recoiled instinctively, throwing up an arm to shield my face as the swarm swept past, some brushing against my coat with a touch as light and chill as graveyard fingers. Holmes stood motionless, the lantern held high, his lean figure silhouetted against the living torrent. When the last straggler had vanished into the darkness behind us, he lowered the light and gave a short laugh. "Pipistrelles, Watson. Harmless insect-eaters. Their colony must extend far into these caverns. Note how the disturbance has left fresh guano upon the floor. Someone has passed this way very recently, and in some haste." I examined the ground as he directed and saw that he was right. Amidst the older, dried deposits were patches of moist droppings, still glistening. My friend collected a small sample in a glass tube, remarking that the diet of the bats might yet tell us something of the tunnel's extent. We pressed on, the passage now sloping gently downward. Side galleries opened upon our left and right, black mouths that exhaled colder air. But Holmes kept to the main way, pausing now and then to examine scratches upon the walls or fragments of decayed wood that suggested long-forgotten storage. At length the tunnel widened into a small natural chamber where the rock ceiling rose into darkness and a trickle of water could be heard. Here the bat colony roosted in countless numbers, clinging to the roof like a living carpet. The beam of the lantern revealed their tiny forms packed so closely that the stone was hidden beneath a writhing blanket of fur and membrane. Holmes swept the light across the floor. "Our predecessor turned aside here," he said, pointing to footprints in the softer earth, broad, heavy impressions that could only belong to a man. "They lead into that smaller passage yonder." Before we could follow, a low door of oak, iron-bound and green with age, confronted us at the far side of the chamber. It stood ajar, and beyond it stone steps descended still deeper. A brass plate upon the door, half obscured by verdigris, bore the faded inscription, "To the dungeon." "This is older work than the smugglers' tunnels," Holmes observed. "Medieval, perhaps even earlier. We shall return here with reinforcements." We retraced our steps and emerged once more into the study, where Lady Eleanor awaited us with ill-concealed anxiety. Over a late supper in the dining hall, where portraits of long-dead Blackmoors glared down upon us from panelled walls, Holmes questioned the household more closely. Hargrove admitted that he had known of the tunnels since boyhood, but professed a deep aversion to them, claiming that the bats had once driven a groom mad. Dr. Vivian Thorne, on the other hand, displayed eager curiosity, producing from her portfolio a sketch she had made of an ancient chart discovered among Sir Reginald's papers. It showed the manor and moat in some detail, with dotted lines suggesting hidden ways beneath. Her eyes shone as she spoke of the Blackmoor treasure, not mere gold, she hinted, but something of greater historical worth. Captain Reed laughed heartily at such notions. "Gold's good enough for me," he declared, draining his glass. "My great-grandfather sailed with the old pirate himself. If there's a hoard, it'll be Spanish doubloons, mark my words." Yet I noticed that his gaze strayed often to the tall windows, beyond which the moat lay black and silent under the moon. Holmes himself said little, but I saw him studying each speaker with that penetrating stare which missed nothing. Later, as we repaired to our rooms, he drew me aside. "Observe the mud upon the boots in the hall, Watson. Despite 3 days without rain, certain impressions are fresh and carry the peculiar black silt of the moat bottom. Someone has been abroad after dark, and not by the drawbridge." That night I found sleep difficult. The guest chamber was vast and draughty, its canopied bed dwarfed by shadows. Towards midnight I was aroused by a faint sound, as of muffled voices or distant wings, coming from the direction of the corridor. Lighting my candle, I stepped out and listened. All was silent. Yet as I turned to re-enter my room, a sudden rush of air extinguished the flame, and for an instant I felt the brush of countless soft bodies against my face. Bats had somehow found their way into the upper floors through some vent or chimney. I relit the candle with some difficulty and examined the room. Upon my dressing table lay the papers I had left neatly stacked. Now they were scattered, as though disturbed by the passage of the swarm. In the morning I mentioned the incident to Holmes, who merely nodded. "A deliberate disturbance, perhaps," he said, "or a warning." When we descended to breakfast, we were met by Hargrove with grave news. During the night, someone had searched the edge of the moat, for Sir Reginald's gold-rimmed spectacles had been found upon the bank, one lens cracked, and both frames thickly smeared with fresh bat guano. Lady Eleanor turned deathly pale. "Then he must have fallen, or been thrown into the water," she whispered. Holmes picked up the spectacles and examined them beneath his lens. "Possible," he said quietly. "But the guano is still moist, and the crack in the lens is recent. Moreover, the moat is deep and sluggish. Objects do not easily wash ashore here. No, Watson, this is no accident. Someone wishes us to believe that Sir Reginald met his end in the black waters, but I am convinced he lies elsewhere, somewhere in the depths we have only begun to explore." And as he spoke, his gaze turned towards the floor, as though he could already see through stone and earth to the hidden ways beneath Blackmoor Manor, where darkness, secrets, and perhaps death itself awaited us. The morning following our first descent into the tunnels dawned grey and cheerless, with a thin mist rising from the moat like steam from some vast cauldron. Over a sombre breakfast, where little was eaten and less was said, Holmes announced his intention of examining the family archives in the library. Lady Eleanor readily assented, and Dr. Vivian Thorne, whose scholarly enthusiasm seemed undimmed by the grim discoveries, offered her assistance with evident eagerness. The library of Blackmoor Manor proved a noble apartment, its high windows looking out upon the moat and its walls lined floor to ceiling with volumes bound in faded leather. Dust lay thick upon the upper shelves, and the air carried that peculiar mustiness which speaks of centuries of neglect. A great oak table stood in the centre, already strewn with papers and charts that Dr. Thorne had been studying. Holmes seated himself, and with that swift precision which characterized all his movements, began sorting the documents. I observed Dr. Thorne closely as she leaned over his shoulder. Her eyes were bright, almost feverish, and her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the brittle pages. "Here," she said at length, spreading out a large sheet of vellum, "is the earliest reference to the treasure. It dates from 1748 and is in the hand of Captain Josiah Blackmoor, the privateer whose name is still whispered with dread along the Yorkshire coast." The document recounted in florid 18th-century prose how Captain Josiah had returned from the Spanish Main laden with spoils, only to find the authorities alert for his arrival. Rather than risk seizure, he had concealed the bulk of his plunder in a place known only to the house itself, guarded by the black waters without and the silent wings within. A crude sketch accompanied the text, showing the manor and moat with a series of dotted lines descending beneath the foundations. Holmes studied it long and carefully through his glass. "The silent wings are plainly the bats," he remarked, "and the reference to whispers suggests some acoustic property of the tunnels, perhaps natural vents that carry sound in curious fashion." Dr. Thorne nodded. "There are later papers that speak of ledgers rather than gold, records of smuggling transactions that could ruin certain noble families even today. Sir Reginald believed the true treasure to be these documents, which might be used to restore the family fortunes through discreet negotiation. I confess the notion startled me. A hoard of incriminating papers seemed a colder, more sinister prize than Spanish doubloons. Yet it fitted the character of the Blackmoors I had glimpsed in the stern portraits about the house. While Holmes continued his examination, I wandered to the windows. The mist still clung to the moat, but as I watched, a sudden ripple broke the surface near the far bank. An unnatural disturbance, as though something large had passed beneath. When I mentioned it to Holmes, he merely smiled. "Interesting, Watson. The moat is fed by underground springs. There may be channels connecting it to the caverns below. We shall investigate that in due course." In the afternoon, we organized a more thorough exploration of the tunnels. This time, Lady Eleanor insisted upon accompanying us, together with Captain Reed and Hargrove, the latter carrying a shotgun against the bats, as he grimly put it. Dr. Thorne remained above, pleading pressure of work upon the papers. We descended by the same route as before, lanterns held high. The bats were quieter now, hanging in their thousands from the vaulted roof, like clusters of strange fruit. Yet as our party advanced, they began to stir uneasily. Soon small groups detached themselves and fluttered about our heads, their high-pitched cries echoing weirdly from the stone. Captain Reed cursed roundly and swung his lantern at them, while Hargrove's face grew ashen. Even Lady Eleanor shrank closer to Holmes, who walked unconcerned, noting how the creature's squeak seemed to mask our footsteps entirely. "Observe," he said, pausing where the passage branched. "The bat's echolocation creates a natural screen of sound. A man might move almost silently beneath such cover." We pressed on until we reached again the iron-bound door that bore the legend, "To the dungeon." Holmes pushed it wide, and we descended a flight of worn stone steps into a vast subterranean chamber supported by massive pillars. Chains depended from the walls, rusted with age, and in the corners lay heaps of rotten straw. The air was colder here, and water dripped mournfully from the ceiling. Upon the floor near one wall I noticed dark stains, old yet unmistakable. Holmes knelt and touched them lightly. "Blood," he said quietly, "but not recent. This dungeon has known violence in centuries past." Captain Reed gave a forced laugh. Smuggler's justice, no doubt. They say the Blackmoors hanged more than one revenue man down here. As he spoke, a sudden gust of air swept through the chamber, extinguishing 2 of our lanterns. In the diminished light, the shadows seemed to leap and dance, and from the depths beyond came again that low, whispering murmur we had heard before, now louder, almost articulate. Lady Eleanor clutched my arm. "The voices of the dead," she whispered. Holmes relit the lanterns with his usual composure. "Merely wind through natural flues," he said, "but cleverly used, perhaps, to frighten the superstitious." We searched the dungeon thoroughly, finding several side cells with barred doors, and, in one, a fragment of paper torn from a larger sheet. Upon it were scrawled the words, "The moat hides the key." Holmes pocketed it without comment. Upon our return to the upper house, tensions among the party were evident. Captain Reed quarrelled openly with Lady Eleanor over the disposition of the estate should Sir Reginald prove dead, while Hargrove was observed by Holmes slipping furtively into the butler's pantry with what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in oilskin. That evening, as I prepared for bed, Holmes entered my room carrying a small batch of bat guano he had collected earlier. "Interesting composition, Watson," he said, showing me the sample beneath his lens. "Traces of fruit pulp. Someone has been feeding the creatures, encouraging larger colonies. Fear is a powerful ally to the wrongdoer." I was about to reply when a sudden clamour arose below. A cry of alarm from one of the servants. We hurried downstairs to find the household gathered in the entrance hall. During our absence, someone had attempted to force the great front door from the outside, leaving deep scratches upon the oak and a quantity of fresh bat droppings upon the step, as though the intruder had come straight from the tunnels. But it was what lay upon the threshold that turned Lady Eleanor faint. A single playing card, the ace of spades, smeared with mud from the moat bottom and pinned to the door by a sailor's knife. Captain Reed's face darkened as he recognized the blade. "That's my own knife," he growled. "Stolen from my room this afternoon." Holmes examined the card carefully. "A melodramatic touch," he murmured, "but revealing. The ace of spades, the death card. Someone wishes us to believe Sir Reginald is dead, and that the killer walks among us." As we stood there in the flickering lamplight, a low, mournful groan seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house, followed by the distant rush of countless wings. The bats were abroad again, and with them, it seemed, the shadows of Blackmoor Manor grew ever deeper and more menacing. I retired that night with my revolver loaded upon the bedside table, little dreaming how soon we should stand face to face with the grim reality that lurked beneath those ancient stones. The discovery of the sailor's knife and the ace of spades upon the threshold cast a deeper gloom over Blackmoor Manor than any mere storm could have done. The household retired that night in a state of nervous apprehension, and I, for one, slept only fitfully, my dreams haunted by the rush of unseen wings and the lap of dark waters against ancient stone. Morning brought no relief. A steady rain had set in, drumming upon the leads and turning the moat into a restless sheet of grey. Holmes, however, was up betimes and abroad before the rest of us had finished breakfast. When I joined him in the library, he was examining the muddy playing card beneath his lens, a faint smile of satisfaction upon his lips. "The mud is characteristic, Watson," he said. "It contains fragments of reed and the shells of certain freshwater mollusks, found only in stagnant, weed-choked waters. Our visitor came directly from the moat, and recently. He would say no more, but insisted that we resume our exploration of the lower regions without delay. This time we went alone, leaving even Hargrove above. Holmes carried a coil of stout rope and his dark lantern, while I brought my service revolver and a second light. We descended through the study trap door and followed the now familiar passage to the dungeon door. The bats were abroad in greater numbers than before, swirling about us in agitated clouds. Yet Holmes paid them no heed beyond noting that their droppings were thicker upon the steps leading downward. "Someone has passed this way since yesterday," he murmured. "The guano has been disturbed and scattered in a manner quite unlike the creature's natural patterns." The dungeon chamber greeted us with its accustomed chill. Water dripped more insistently from the vaulted ceiling, and the air seemed heavier, as though burdened with some new corruption. We moved methodically from cell to cell, examining every corner, until at last we came to the farthest and deepest, a narrow vault whose iron door hung half off its hinges. Holmes's lantern swept the interior, and there, in the far corner, we beheld a sight that froze the blood in my veins. Slumped against the wall, half buried beneath a fall of masonry, lay the body of a man. Even in the uncertain light, I recognized the gaunt features and white beard of Sir Reginald Blackmoor. His eyes stared sightlessly at the roof. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, and upon his breast, clutched in one rigid hand, was a folded map of vellum, the twin, it seemed, of the burned fragment we had found in the study. I knelt instinctively to examine him, but one glance sufficed. The man had been dead for at least 2 days. The cause appeared plain. A portion of the ancient wall had collapsed, bringing down great blocks of stone that had crushed his chest and skull. That guano lay thick upon the debris, as though the creatures had roosted there undisturbed for years. "A tragic accident," I said at length. "He must have come down here alone, seeking the treasure, and dislodged the stones in the dark." Holmes made no reply. He was upon his knees, scrutinizing the scene with that intense concentration I knew so well. For many minutes he worked in silence, measuring, brushing aside dust, examining the body itself with delicate care. At last he rose and turned to me. "Accident? No, Watson. This is murder, and murder most ingeniously contrived." He pointed to the fallen stones. "Observe. The dust upon the upper surfaces is undisturbed, yet the lower faces are clean. These blocks were placed here recently, not dislodged by any fall. Moreover, the body shows no abrasion consistent with crushing. There is lividity upon the back, indicating that death occurred elsewhere, and the corpse was moved post-mortem." I looked again and saw that he was right. What I had taken for crushed limbs were merely contorted in rigor. The true injuries were subtler. A darkening about the lips, a faint odor I now recognized. "Poison?" I asked. "Undoubtedly, probably a swift vegetable alkaloid. The staging is meant to suggest that Sir Reginald triggered a booby trap set by his ancestors. Even the bat guano has been sprinkled to lend antiquity to the scene." He gently pried the map from the dead man's fingers. It was a detailed plan of the tunnels, with certain passages marked in fresh ink and a cross indicating a chamber beneath the moat itself. "A forgery," Holmes declared after brief inspection. "The vellum is genuine, but the ink is modern. Someone wished us to find this, and to follow it." We summoned the household, and soon the dungeon was filled with horrified onlookers. Lady Eleanor wept silently, supported by Dr. Thorne, while Captain Reed muttered oaths beneath his breath. Hargrove alone preserved his iron composure, though his hands trembled as he held the lantern. The local constable, a stolid Yorkshireman named Braithwaite, arrived within the hour and, after a cursory examination, pronounced the death accidental. Holmes said nothing to contradict him publicly, but later, in the privacy of the library, he confided his true conclusions. "The murderer is among us, Watson. The poison was administered above, probably in Sir Reginald's evening tea or brandy, and the body conveyed here through the tunnels. The bats have been encouraged to swarm more thickly of late. Their noise and confusion would mask any sound of dragging or movement." That afternoon we interviewed the suspects anew. Lady Eleanor declared she had retired early on the night of the disappearance and had heard nothing. Dr. Thorne admitted to working late upon the papers, but insisted she had remained in the library. Captain Reed claimed to have spent the evening in the billiard room, though no one could corroborate the hour of his retirement. Hargrove, as ever, had been the last to see Sir Reginald alive, locking the study door at 11. Holmes listened to each with grave attention, his eyes missing nothing. When Dr. Thorne mentioned in passing that she had handled many of the old maps, he merely nodded. Yet I noticed him later examining her gloves, which bore faint grey stains, guano perhaps, or merely dust from the archives. In the late afternoon we hired a boatman from the nearby village and ventured upon the moat itself. The rain had ceased, but the water remained black and sullen. Holmes lay prone upon the thwarts, trailing his hand and peering into the depths. At length he gave a low exclamation. "Here," he said, pointing to a patch of weed near the northern wall. "The stems are bent and broken as though by the passage of a submerged object. And see, beneath this overhanging stone there is a grating half concealed by silt." We probed with a boat hook and found that the grating covered an opening large enough for a man to pass, a secret water gate connecting the moat to the tunnels below, free of bats, but choked with slime and weed. As we rowed back, Holmes's face wore that look of quiet elation which told me the net was drawing tight. That night, as I sat alone in my room writing up my notes, I heard again the whispering murmur, closer now, almost beneath my feet. Rising, I followed the sound to a disused chimney in the corner. Kneeling, I perceived a faint draught, and beyond it, the echo of recorded speech. With Holmes's assistance, we traced the flue to a hidden recess in the tunnel wall, where a small phonograph stood concealed, its horn directed upward to carry sound through the vents. The cylinder bore Sir Reginald's own voice, repeating over and over the words from his note. "The treasure whispers in the dark. Beware the wings of night." Holmes stopped the machine and turned to me, his eyes alight. "A lure, Watson. The murderer used this to draw Sir Reginald to his death, and perhaps to draw us deeper into the trap. But the ink upon the forged map is scarcely dry. Our killer grows careless." And even as he spoke, a distant clamour arose from the tunnels below. A shout, the crash of falling stone, and then silence. We seized our lanterns and hurried downward, little knowing that we were at last upon the threshold of the final revelation. The grim discovery of Sir Reginald's body in the dungeon, coupled with the revelation of the hidden phonograph, convinced me that we stood upon the brink of unmasking the murderer. Holmes, however, counselled patience. "The fox is startled, Watson," he said as we climbed once more into the upper house, "but not yet run to earth. We must allow the culprit to believe the net is still wide before we draw it tight." He spent the remainder of that day in apparently idle pursuits, examining the moat grating from the boat once more, collecting further samples of bat guano from various parts of the tunnels, and questioning the servants with seeming casualness about their master's movements. Yet I knew from the keen glitter in his eyes that every observation was being fitted into the mosaic of his deductions. In the evening he assembled the entire household in the drawing-room and, with the utmost gravity, announced his conclusion that Sir Reginald had been poisoned before ever he reached the dungeon. A murmur of consternation arose. Lady Eleanor turned pale, Captain Reed's face darkened, and Dr. Thorne's sharp features betrayed a momentary flicker of alarm before she composed herself. Holmes proceeded to demonstrate the working of the phonograph, which Hargrove had fetched at his direction. The cylinder, when revolved, repeated Sir Reginald's recorded warning in hollow, echoing tones that seemed to issue from the very walls. He explained how the machine had been concealed in a flue to lure the old man downward on the fatal night, the bat's cries masking any sound of approach from behind. Someone in this house, he concluded quietly, knew Sir Reginald's habits, his passion for the family mystery, and his trust in voices from the past. That person administered poison in his nightly glass of hot milk, sent up, I believe, by Hargrove at 10:30, and then waited until the drug took effect. Hargrove stiffened. I merely followed Sir Reginald's standing orders, sir. The milk was prepared in the kitchen under my supervision and taken up by the housemaid. Holmes nodded. Quite so. But the alkaloid could have been introduced at any stage. The point is that the murderer then conveyed the body through the tunnels and staged the scene we discovered. Captain Reed struck the table with his fist. This is intolerable. Are we all to be suspected? I was in the billiard room until midnight. Ask the footman. The footman retired at 11. Holmes replied mildly. And the billiard room window overlooks the moat. A man might slip out, swim the water gate, and return within 20 minutes without being observed. Reed subsided, glowering. Dr. Thorne spoke next, her voice steady. Mr. Holmes, you have shown us how the murder was committed. But the motive? My own researches suggest the treasure is nothing more than old ledgers, valuable perhaps for historical reasons, but hardly worth murder. Precisely, said Holmes. And yet someone believed those ledgers worth killing for, or feared them. He turned suddenly to Hargrove. You have served this family for 40 years, I understand. Did you ever place fruit, apples perhaps, or pears, in the upper tunnels to encourage the bats? The butler hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. As a boy, I was told it kept intruders away. The creatures grow bolder when well fed. Sir Reginald disliked it, but after his father died, I resumed the practice, only to protect the house. A protection that served the murderer well, Holmes observed. That night brought fresh drama. I was awakened near 1 o'clock by a muffled cry and the sound of splashing from the direction of the moat. Seizing my revolver, I hurried to the window in time to see a dark figure clambering from the water onto the northern bank. Before I could raise an alarm, the shape vanished into the shadows of the old boathouse. I roused Holmes, and together we descended to the tunnels by the study route. The bats were restless, swirling in greater numbers than ever, but Holmes pressed on until we reached the Watergate grating. Here the silt had been freshly disturbed, and upon the iron bars clung strands of dark wool, matching, I noted, the coat Captain Reed had worn at dinner. We followed a side passage that sloped sharply downward, the air growing colder and damper until our boots splashed in shallow water. The tunnel narrowed until we were forced to stoop, and the bats no longer followed. Whether from the flood or the confined space, I could not tell. Suddenly Holmes halted. Listen. From ahead came a low, rhythmic creaking, followed by a grunt of effort. We advanced cautiously until the passage opened into a small vaulted chamber directly beneath the moat bed. Water seeped through the ceiling in steady drops, and in the center stood a crude wooden crane, evidently a relic of the smugglers, its pulley attached to a sodden chest, half submerged in a pool. Kneeling beside it was a figure in dripping clothes, straining at the rope. The lantern light caught the glint of reddish beard. Captain Reed. He started violently as we emerged, his hand flying to his belt, but Holmes was upon him in an instant, wrenching away the knife he drew. An enterprising midnight swim, Captain, said Holmes coolly, but the chest is empty, has been these 100 years, I fancy. Your accomplice removed the contents earlier. Reed glared defiance. I came down because I heard noises. Thought someone was tampering with the Watergate. A plausible tale, Holmes replied, but the wool fibres upon the grating are from your coat, and your boots match the prints we found yesterday. However, you are not the principal. You were lured here tonight by another phonograph cylinder, placed to draw you into compromise. Reed's bravado crumbled. He admitted to having been approached by a member of the household who promised him a share of the treasure if he would create diversions, scattering bat guano, leaving the ace of spades, swimming the moat to plant false clues. He swore he had known nothing of the murder itself. Holmes listened gravely. Then you are a tool, Captain, not the hand that wields it. But tools can be dangerous. We escorted Reed above and locked him in his room under Hargrove's watchful eye. Dawn was breaking grey over the moat when Holmes turned to me. The murderer grows desperate, Watson. By implicating Reed, they hope to divert us. But the poison residue upon the milk glass, traces of aconitine, and the forged map with its still damp ink point unmistakably to one person. We must act swiftly before another attempt is made. Even as he spoke, a sudden uproar arose from the entrance hall. We hurried down to find Lady Eleanor confronting Dr. Thorne in the presence of the terrified servants. "You knew!" Lady Eleanor cried, holding aloft a small vial. "This was hidden in your room. Aconitine! The same poison that killed my uncle." Dr. Thorne's face was ashen, but she drew herself erect. "A plant, like everything else," she said coldly. "I am a scholar, not a murderer." Holmes stepped forward, his expression stern. "Denial is useless, Dr. Thorne. The stains upon your gloves are not guano, but aconitine crystals. The forged map bears your fingerprints in the ink, and the phonograph cylinders were wound with a scholar's precision. Your precision." For a moment she stood motionless. Then, with a sudden cry of rage, she darted towards the door. Holmes and I gave chase as she fled towards the library and the trap-door beyond. The pursuit led us once more into the tunnels, where the bats rose in a frantic cloud about us. Dr. Thorne ran fleetly, lantern in hand, but Holmes knew the passages now as well as she. At the dungeon steps, she turned at bay, hurling her lantern at us so that burning oil splashed across the stone. In the confusion, she vanished into a side gallery we had not before explored. We followed, dodging the swirling bats, until at last we cornered her at the very edge of the underground pool beneath the moat. There she stood, trapped and defiant, the black water lapping at her feet. "The game is up, Dr. Thorne," Holmes said quietly. "Come peacefully." But even as he spoke, I saw her hand move towards her pocket, and knew that the final deception was not yet played. Dr. Thorne's hand emerged from her pocket clutching a small derringer, its barrel glinting evilly in the lantern light. For a heartbeat, the underground chamber seemed frozen, the black water lapping at her heels, the bats wheeling overhead like a living canopy, and Holmes standing motionless a few paces away, his grey eyes fixed upon her with that calm, inexorable certainty I had seen so often in moments of crisis. "Put it down, Dr. Thorne," he said quietly. "You have no escape this way. The Watergate is watched, and every passage above is known to us." Her lips curled in a bitter smile. "Known to you, perhaps, Mr. Holmes, but not to me. I have studied these tunnels for months, long before you ever set foot in Blackmoor Manor." With a sudden movement, she fired. Not at us, but at the rope, mooring the old smuggler's skiff that floated in the pool. The cord parted with a snap, and the little boat swung away into the darkness of the outflow channel. At the same instant, she hurled a small packet into the water. It burst with a hiss, releasing a cloud of pungent vapor that set the bats screaming in frenzy. In the confusion, she sprang aside, vanishing into a narrow fissure we had not previously noticed. Holmes leapt forward, but the swirling creatures and the choking fumes drove us back momentarily. By the time we recovered, she was gone. We hurried back through the tunnels, the bats following in agitated streams, until we emerged into the study. Holmes immediately summoned the household and Constable Braithwaite, who had remained on the premises since the discovery of the body. "Dr. Thorne is the murderer," he announced without preamble. "The evidence is now complete. She poisoned Sir Reginald with aconitine introduced into his bedtime milk, using her access to the kitchen under pretense of late-night research. The phonograph recordings were her work. She possessed both the scholarly knowledge to operate the device and the opportunity to record Sir Reginald's voice during earlier visits. The forged map found upon the body was drawn by her hand, the ink matches that in her portable writing case, and the symbols betray an archaeologist's precision rather than an amateur's. The stains upon her gloves are aconitine crystals, not guano as she claimed. Her motive, not simple greed, but revenge. Her own family was ruined by the Blackmoor smuggling ring a century ago. The ledgers she sought would have provided proof to blackmail the descendants of those who profited, restoring her fortunes at their expense. Lady Eleanor gazed at him in horror, but she seemed so dedicated to preserving history. "A convenient mask," Holmes replied. She encouraged the bat colony by placing fruit in the upper tunnels, knowing their presence would lend credence to tales of a curse and mask her movements. Captain Reed was her unwitting tool, promised a share of the treasure if he created diversions, the ace of spades, the spectacles in the moat, the midnight swims. Hargrove's old habit of feeding the bats merely played into her hands. Captain Reed, still confined, was brought down and confronted with the facts. He admitted his part readily enough, protesting that he had believed it mere trickery to hasten the discovery of gold. "We organized a systematic search. Constable Braithwaite and his men guarded the drawbridge and the moat banks, while Holmes, Hargrove and I returned to the tunnels. Holmes had already deduced Thorne's likely path. She will make for the old smuggler's outlet beneath the North Tower," he said as we descended once more. "It connects directly to the moat and was once used for running contraband at high tide. The bats avoid that passage because of flooding. She will believe it safe from pursuit." We followed a winding gallery that sloped steadily downward, the air growing ever more damp until water seeped through the walls. The bats no longer accompanied us. Only the distant echo of their cries reached us from the upper levels. At length the passage opened into a low cavern, where the moat waters lapped against a flight of stone steps, leading upward to a rusted iron door. Holmes paused, listening. From beyond came the scrape of boots upon stone and the splash of oars. We extinguished our lanterns and crept forward. Through the half-open door we saw Dr. Thorne upon the moat itself, in the act of boarding the same small boat we had used earlier. She had evidently forced the boathouse lock. The mist still clung to the water, and in the pale light of early dawn she appeared almost spectral as she bent to the oars. Holmes stepped out upon the bank. "Dr. Thorne," he called, his voice ringing clear across the water. "It is useless. Surrender now and spare yourself further humiliation." She started violently, nearly oversetting the boat, then seized the oars and pulled frantically for the far side. But Holmes had anticipated this. At his signal, Constable Braithwaite and two men emerged from the reeds opposite where they had lain concealed. Cut off, she turned the boat desperately, only to find Hargrove and myself advancing along the causeway. Trapped, she shipped the oars and sat motionless, her face a mask of defeat. As we drew the boat to shore and assisted her out, she made no further resistance. "You are a clever man, Mr. Holmes," she said bitterly as the handcuffs clicked upon her wrists. "But cleverness cannot restore what was taken from my family." "Nor can murder," Holmes replied gravely. "Justice may be delayed, madam, but it is not always denied." She was led away to the village lockup, and with her departure the shadows seemed to lift from Blackmoor Manor. The bats, deprived now of artificial feeding, began to disperse, and the oppressive whispers that had haunted the house were heard no more. Later that day, guided by the genuine fragment of map preserved from the study fire, Holmes located the true hiding place, a small iron-bound chest concealed behind a loose stone in the dungeon's central pillar. It contained not gold, but a bundle of yellowed ledgers meticulously recording the Blackmoor smuggling transactions of the 18th century. With them were letters proving that Dr. Thorne's ancestors had indeed been betrayed and ruined by the family. Lady Eleanor, now sole mistress of the manor, declared her intention of destroying the documents. "Let the past bury its dead," she said quietly. "We have suffered enough from old sins." Holmes offered no objection. As we prepared to depart the following morning, he stood upon the drawbridge gazing across the moat, where the first sunlight in many days glinted upon the water. "A curious case, Watson," he remarked. "The bats proved innocent after all, mere instruments of misdirection like so many supposed supernatural agencies. Human greed and vengeance were the true shadows here, I could not but agree." Yet, as our dog-cart rumbled away across the moors, I glanced back once at the ancient house standing sombre against the sky, and I fancied I saw a final cloud of wings issue from one of the tall chimneys. Perhaps the last farewell of those harmless creatures who had, unwitting, played their part in the grim drama of Blackmoor Manor. With the arrest of Dr. Vivian Thorne and the recovery of the hidden ledgers, the shadows that had brooded so long over Blackmoor Manor seemed at last to disperse. The rain, which had persisted for days, ceased during the night, and when I awoke upon the morning of our departure, the sun was shining pale but clear upon the moat, turning its sullen waters to a sheet of tarnished silver. A fresh wind stirred the reeds along the banks, and from the tall chimneys of the old house, thin plumes of blue smoke rose straight into the wintry air. Holmes and I breakfasted alone with Lady Eleanor in the great dining hall. The portraits of the Blackmoor ancestors looked down upon us as solemnly as ever, but the atmosphere of dread that had oppressed us since our arrival was gone. Lady Eleanor, though pale and worn with grief and the shock of recent revelations, bore herself with quiet dignity. "I shall destroy the ledgers this very day," she said, pouring our coffee with a steady hand. "They have brought nothing but misery to this house. With my uncle's estate now settled upon me without dispute, I intend to repair the manor and open portions of it to scholars, under proper supervision, of course. Perhaps some good may yet come of our unfortunate history." Holmes inclined his head. "A wise resolution, Lady Eleanor. The past is a chain that binds only those who cling to it. Let the dead bury their sins, as you so rightly said." Captain Reed had departed at first light under Constable Braithwaite's escort, bound for York to face charges of complicity, though Holmes doubted the evidence would suffice for a heavy sentence. "A foolish man," he remarked later, "led astray by greed and the cleverer mind of another. He will serve as a warning to others who mistake melodrama for cunning." Hargrove, faithful to the last, supervised the loading of our modest luggage onto the dog-cart. As we took our seats upon the drawbridge, he approached with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Sir Reginald's papers, sir," he said to Holmes in a low voice. "Those you selected from the study. He would have wished you to have them, I think, in memory of the service you rendered this house." Holmes accepted the parcel with a grave nod, and we shook hands with the old retainer. I noticed that his eyes, usually so impassive, were moist as he watched us drive away. The moors lay bright under the winter sun, the heather touched with frost that sparkled like diamonds. As our cart rumbled along the rough track, I turned once more to look back at Blackmoor Manor. The ancient house stood foursquare against the sky, its gargoyles no longer menacing but merely quaint relics of a bygone age. And high above the northern turret I saw, for the last time, a thin stream of bats issuing forth, fewer now, and flying lazily in the daylight as though reluctant to leave their ancestral home. A remarkable case, Holmes, I said, settling back into my seat. One that might almost have been contrived by a sensational novelist. Moated manor, hidden treasure, secret passages, swarms of bats and whispers in the dark. He smiled faintly, lighting his pipe. Yet in the end, Watson, it resolved itself into the oldest of motives. Revenge, tempered with greed. The bats proved the most innocent actors in the drama, mere creatures of instinct, exploited to lend a supernatural colour to a very human crime. How often have I remarked that the most grotesque apparitions owe their terror to the fears of men rather than to any inherent malignancy? True, I replied, though I confess those tunnels gave me a turn or two. I shall not soon forget the sensation of those wings brushing past in the darkness. Holmes chuckled. A harmless distraction, my dear fellow. Nature's own red herring, one might say. The true villainy lay in the mind that used them to conceal footsteps and to foster superstition. We fell silent then, each occupied with his thoughts as the manor dwindled behind us. By evening we were back in the familiar comfort of Baker Street, the roar of London traffic a welcome change after the brooding stillness of the moors. Mrs. Hudson had kept a bright fire burning and a cold supper ready, and it was with a profound sense of relief that I sank into my old armchair. Holmes, however, was soon at his chemical table, examining the samples of bat guano he had brought back with that meticulous care he bestowed upon even the humblest clue. "You will publish the adventure, I suppose," he said at length without looking up. "In due course," I replied, "though I shall soften some of the darker passages. The public relishes a touch of the Gothic, but there are limits." He gave a short laugh. "As you wish, Watson. Only remember that the bats were blameless. Posterity should not hold them accountable for the sins of Blackmoor Manor." And so the affair ended, leaving behind it only the memory of a grim old house upon its lonely moat, and the knowledge that even the most impenetrable shadows yield at last to the clear light of reason. Yet sometimes, when the wind howls about our windows on a stormy night, I fancy I hear again the dry rustle of countless wings and the faint whispering echoes of secrets long buried beneath ancient stone. And I know that wherever Sherlock Holmes may be, he is listening too, with that quiet smile that tells me the game for him is forever afoot.